Lesson 19, Propaganda, NSDAP in Power. Let's review Lesson 18. We were looking at Hitler's foreign policy from around the middle of 1939 to 1941, and just like Lesson 17, we saw that NSDAP foreign policy was hugely successful. However, war against Poland resulted in a dip in popularity. The German people were not keen on war. They loved Hitler's foreign policy successes before the invasion of Poland, the conquest of Czechoslovakia, or at least the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, Anschluss, rearmament, etc. But all of those were bloodless victories. The German people were not keen on war. However, the spectacular victories over Poland, the spectacular victories over France and Britain, and minor victories over Holland, over Belgium, Denmark, Norway, led to a huge boost in Hitler's popularity. In the summer of 1940, after the conquest of France, Hitler was probably at the height of his popularity. He was at the zenith of his popularity in Germany. Up to 1941, Hitler had achieved many of his foreign policy goals. So he had delivered on several of his promises. He certainly destroyed the Treaty of Versailles. He had gained Lebensraum in the east for the German people. He eliminated France as a threat, and seemingly the United Kingdom as well, but we will see that that's not the case. And he united almost all Germans under the Third Reich. The only place really where there were Germans still that were not a part of the Third Reich was Switzerland. And we left last lesson discussing the fact that, however, by December, January 1941-42, there was an air of foreboding in Germany. That's to say, the Soviet Union had been bloodied, but it had not been conquered. So the German people were not losing their faith in Hitler or that type of thing, but it seemed like easy victories were long gone. And indeed they were. So what is propaganda? We looked at this before when we were looking at the reasons for the NSDAP coming to power in 1933. Now we're looking at propaganda once the NSDAP was in power and how they used propaganda to maintain or help maintain their control over the German people. So we're going to look at some dictionary definitions here and focus on only one of them. Number one. Information, ideas, or rumors deliberately spread widely to help or harm a person, group, movement, institution, nation, etc. 2. The particular doctrines or principles propagated by an organization or movement. Number 3. This is to tell us which one we're doing. We're looking at number 1. We will be concentrating on the first definition. So it's really about information, ideas deliberately spread widely to help, in this case, to help the NSDAP. And indeed, we're looking at the distortion of reality in many ways. We're looking at the government lying to its people, distorting reality, and trying to change their perspective of things. Well, what did Hitler say about propaganda in Mein Kampf? I don't think we've looked at these quotes before. They're rather interesting about what Hitler thinks about the mass of humanity, including his fellow Germans. It's not a very positive appraisal of human beings. Let's look. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. As soon as you sacrifice this slogan and try to be many-sided, the effect will piddle away. For the crowd can neither digest nor retain the material offered. In this way, the result is weakened and in the end entirely cancelled out. There's a famous acronym in sales called KISS, K-I-S-S, which means keep it simple, stupid. This is kind of saying that really. You need to keep the message very, very simple. You need to keep repeating that message, that's to say harping on that message so everybody understands it. Let's look at the second paragraph. The purpose of propaganda is not to provide interesting distraction for blasé young gentlemen, but to convince, and what I mean is to convince the masses. But the masses are slow moving, and they always require a certain time before they are ready even to notice a thing. And only after the simplest ideas are repeated thousands of times will the masses finally remember them. So once again, what we see here is this idea of keeping the message simple so you can convince the vast majority of the country of whatever it is you're trying to convince them. So again, we're using propaganda as a way to control. And that's what we get from Mein Kampf. Joseph Goebbels, who of course was Hitler's propaganda minister, he said this at the Nuremberg rally of 1934. Quote, "It was our sharpest weapon in conquering the state. It remains our sharpest weapon in defending and building the state. Although this is perhaps still not clear to the rest of the world, it was obvious to us that we had to use the weapon with which we had conquered the state to defend the state. Otherwise, we faced the danger that we could lose the people even though we had power, and that, without the people, we would lose power." So Goebbels here is really saying the most important factor in our control of the people, certainly in becoming the party that was in power, was propaganda, and to maintain our control over the German people, we must continue to use propaganda. Goebbels is perhaps a little bit biased in this respect because, of course, he's in charge of propaganda, and perhaps he is exaggerating the importance of propaganda. Personally, I do not think propaganda is the most important factor in the NSDAP's control over Germany from 1933 to 1945. And I'll talk more about that in a later lesson. But suffice to say, propaganda is very important in controlling the German people, or at least maintaining the support of the German people. So what were the Nazis' propaganda goals once they were in power? Number one, convince those Germans who were not yet supporters to support National Socialism. Remember, in January 1933, probably around 40% of Germans are supporters of National Socialism. If we go back a few lessons, we'll remember that the NSDAP were only polling around 35% in those last elections of the Weimar regime. So let's be generous and say 40%. So they need to convince more Germans to support the regime. A second goal is to win hearts and minds. That's to say, build and strengthen the Volksgemeinschaft. They need to really create zealots in National Socialism, people who really believe in the tenets, that's to say, the key points of National Socialism. 3, increase the fervor in National Socialism of those Germans who already support the NSDAP. So of those 40% who were voting NSDAP in elections before January 1933, the Nazis want to make those people even stronger supporting Germans in National Socialism. And finally, coordinate all cultural activities and media into National Socialism. So again, to promote Gleichschaltung coordination. So cultural activities which will be used as a form of propaganda, and of course the media, which will be used as a form of propaganda, need to be taken over ultimately by the Nazi state. We looked at education in a previous lesson when we were looking at culture. However, it's important to recognize that education can be a form of propaganda through indoctrination. This was surely the case in National Socialist Germany, and we will look at this. So, spreading propaganda. How did they do it? Well, there was a Ministry for Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda that was created in March 1933. It was headed by Goebbels, and by 1937, there were 14,000 Nazis employed in this ministry. So Hitler and the NSDAP were not trying to hide this. They were not trying to hide the fact that they were propagandizing to the German people. They created a whole government department dedicated to propaganda. I think it is rather funny, or amusing anyway, that they also tie in enlightenment into this ministry, the idea that they're shining a light or creating a light for German people to see the truth of National Socialism and the conspiracy of the Jews and all that other nonsense. And another organ that was created was the Reich Culture Chamber. This was created in September 1933. It was also headed by Goebbels. It controlled the artistic life in Germany. And again, this would be a form of propaganda as well. And indeed, it was under the Ministry for Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda. So what we're going to do now is look at various forms of media and really delve into the ways the NSDAP began to control these media and also how they used them to propagate, how they used these media to try to achieve those things they wanted to achieve. And also we'll look at their effectiveness eventually. So the press. All members of the press, journalists, editors, publishers, were controlled through the Reich Press Chamber. Hitler passed the so-called Editor's Law in October 1933. And what that law stated was, editors mustn't publish anything calculated to weaken the strength of the Reich abroad or at home, the resolution of the community, German defense, culture, or the economy, or to injure the religious sensibilities of others, as well as everything offensive to the honor or dignity of a German. So really, and that might sound, oh, that actually sounds okay to me. Why should people be allowed to do those things? Well, this is a clear attack on free speech and the right to a free press. So editors, journalists, publishers, etc. are not allowed to write and publish about things that are going to upset the NSDAP. And eventually the NSDAP gradually took over ownership of many publications through the Nazi publishing house Franz Ihrer Verlag. In 1939, the NSDAP owned 69% of all publications, and this grew to 82% by 1944. And as for the 30% or so in 1939 or the 20% or so in 1944 that were not owned, they were under strict control by the NSDAP. They had become essentially de facto, that's to say, in reality, organs of the NSDAP. Radio. This was cutting-edge technology in the 1930s, which in 2021, when I am recording this, that's quite amazing that radio was cutting-edge technology, but it was. And Hitler and the NSDAP and Goebbels, they recognized the power of this new medium. And so the state subsidized radios for Germans. They called it the People's Receiver. And by 1939, 70% of households owned one. Well, why would they subsidize this? Of course, they're going to use radios for propaganda. Goebbels estimated that 56 million Germans listened to state broadcasts in 1935 alone. So this was a very powerful medium for the NSDAP to spread their propaganda. When particularly important speeches were broadcast, the NSDAP would call for work stoppages and use public loudspeakers so everybody could hear important speeches from Hitler, for example. Film was another powerful medium. Film had been around for several decades. However, this was used to good effect as well. The NSDAP gradually increased its control over film companies and therefore content. Film companies were totally nationalized in 1942. I don't think that is a surprise as the war started to go badly for the NSDAP and they started to take over more and more of German society and becoming more and more totalitarian as the war became total war and as the war started going badly. Censorship was exerted on many American films. They didn't stop importing American films. Certain films, yes, but they did continue to bring in foreign films, especially American films, because they were quite popular. Only a minority of films were openly propagandistic. And I listed a few here. Triumph of the Will, Olympia, The Eternal Jew, and Seuss the Jew. Entertainment took priority over propaganda. However, before films rolled, NSDAP-approved newsreels were played for propaganda purposes as well, because you have a captive audience in the movie theater, so it makes sense to show newsreels that the people are then forced to watch, and that's a good way to propagandize to those people as well. Photographs. Key shots were carefully stage managed. Hitler practiced expressions and poses, and indeed he had been doing this going back to the 1920s. You can see some very bizarre photographs of Hitler doing poses from the 1920s because he was trained, apparently by a hypnotist, about how to do certain poses to captivate his audiences. So Hitler knew all about expressions and poses by the time he's in power in 1933. Many photographs were widely reproduced for Germans, sometimes as postcards, sometimes placed in cigarette packets. Hitler also had an official photographer who would follow him around and take key photographs, which again would be stage managed. So here are some interesting photographs. There's Hitler with a bunch of children, everyone's smiling, Hitler smiling, big surprise. This is almost a cliche when it comes to politicians and children, because he looks like he's a normal guy. Hitler with more, well, in this case, adolescent girls. They're all happy. And again, if you look at this, and if we go back to the idea of Hitler being a charismatic guy, he doesn't look particularly charismatic to us. Certainly doesn't look charismatic to me. But I think those are genuine expressions of happiness there. That is not faked girls smiling and being told to smile. They are really, really excited to be around the leader of Germany. There's another photograph with children, of course, perhaps not as enthusiastic to children. I think, if anything, the children look a little bit confused as to why they're there. This one's interesting. You've got Hitler in his whites, his dress whites, I guess you could call them. He's doing a kind of cheeky pose. And again, we have genuine adoration and humor from the adolescent girls that are around him. And again, another one, you've got some type of ceremony here because you've got people in various dress behind Hitler. And again, you've got genuine happiness and almost adulation of Hitler here with the women on the right. So moving on to another medium, posters. This was another easy way to spread propaganda. The messages were simple enough for anyone to understand. Let's look at some of these posters. So here's one. You've got Hitler in the background, somewhat faded out. You've got a German youth, a member of the Hitler Youth in the foreground. And what does it say? Young people serve the Führer. Very, very simple message. This is a girl who is in the League of German Girls. And the message here is build youth hostels and homes. This is a poster based on the idea of winter help, where members of the Hitlerjugend, that's to say the Hitler Youth, and also the League of German Girls would go around with little cans where people would throw their coins to help out other Germans. So this is an interesting and very straightforward propaganda poster as well. Long live Germany. Well, that one is about as simple as they can be. Long live Germany. Adolf Hitler's leading us to a glorious future. You've got an eagle up there, which is a symbol of Germany as well. You've got the light shining down, perhaps even from heaven. Very straightforward. This one, all the people say yes. This was linked to one of the plebiscites for Hitler's policies. I believe it was with the Anschluss with Austria. Again, a simple message. All the people say yes. This was a way to get the yes vote out for that foreign policy success. Another form of propaganda were meetings and rallies. And we looked at meetings and rallies in our previous lesson on propaganda. And again, big surprise, this was carried forward after the Nazis gained power in 1933. These were highly stage-managed affairs. Goebbels used lighting, architecture, music, Nazi symbols, and choreographed moves for dramatic effect. So almost like a pageant in a way. Once in power, these were used on a grand scale. And we can understand why. Before the Nazis were in power, these rallies would cost a lot of money. And I think I talked about this in a previous lesson. There were times where the Nazis were a bit strapped for cash, and using these rallies were a way, one, to get more supporters who would perhaps give money to the cause, but they themselves cost huge amounts of money. So they couldn't always be on a grand scale. Once the Nazis are in power, of course, they are the state. So they can use government resources to fund all of this stuff and make them even bigger. Now, this is an interesting quotation from Peter Adam, who wrote a book called The Arts of the Third Reich. This is what he said about rallies. The rallies expressed power, order, solemnity. The timing of pauses and the stage management of climaxes were as important as the music and banners. There was no casual spectator. Everyone played a part. Discipline, obedience, self-sacrifice, loyalty, duty. These were the highest virtues. The individual had to enter the mass. Carefully organized, these rallies combined uniforms, mass movements, music, flags, and symbols, often at night, and created a feeling of wishing to belong to the movement. So again, another form of powerful propaganda. This is one of the more famous ones. This is from the Nuremberg Rally, I think in 1936. You often see this on the cover of various books, and it is the rally is amazing. If you look at that wide shot, you look at all these Wehrmacht soldiers, it's a rather stunning display of Nazi power. And you can see if you were a part of that rally, you're in a real mass movement. It's almost like a religious festival in some ways. Now, this is a similar shot. You can see it from a different angle. You can see the crowd in the foreground. Some are Nazis in uniform, others are just civilians. And here we have another example. I think the color has been enhanced there. I think the original is probably in black and white, but you get the idea. Again, very, very powerful, with tens of thousands of people in the same area. Of course, Hitler's going to be giving speeches, so are other Nazis, and that type of thing. Again, the Triumph of the Will film that I mentioned a few minutes ago, it is about the Nuremberg Rally of 1936. It's filmed at Nuremberg. Leni Riefenstahl, who is a very famous German filmmaker, she directed that film. And it is a very powerful piece of propaganda. But it's also interesting because you can see this Nuremberg rally shot live ultimately. It's easy to find on the internet. Not so much on YouTube anymore, but you can find it on places like Vimeo and other things. So moving on to the arts and culture, this was used, or the arts were used as a powerful form of propaganda as well. This is from the Theater Law of 1934, of course passed by decree by Hitler using the Enabling Act because he did not have to have the Reichstag do anything by this point. This was from the law. The arts are for the National Socialist State a public exercise. They are not only aesthetic, but also moral in nature, and in the public interest demands not only police supervision, but also guidance. Well, it doesn't get any clearer than that. The arts are going to be used by the state, and the state's also going to dictate what the arts are going to be. The arts are going to be supervised by the state. That's to say, they're going to be spied on, I guess you could say. Or if you do not produce the art that the state wants, you're probably going to be in some type of trouble. And also the state is going to guide artists in what they are supposed to produce. So let's examine some forms of art a little bit more closely, starting with paintings and sculptures. Well, modern abstract art was banned. So that type of art like Cubism, perhaps something like The Bombing of Guernica by Picasso, those type of things would be banned. Hitler demanded clear representational art. That's to say, the art that is produced, Hitler demanded clear representational art. So what that means is if an artist wanted to paint something regarding German peasants, well, that painting better look like German peasants. It better not be distorted or be something very abstract in the sense that whatever you're looking at doesn't look anything like German peasant farmers. So it has to look like the thing that you're painting. What kind of things were painted? Well, anything heroic. The peasants, but in an idealized way, almost a romantic way. Germans as warriors. And idealized women, which would be women who are the perfect mothers. Remember the 3 Ks: cooking, children, and church. Hitler, of course, was depicted as a wise and imperious leader, almost above the German people, almost removed from the German people in a way. Of course, the people's community should be glorified. And just like other forms of propaganda, art must be accessible to the masses. The message must be simple. So you're going to have paintings that are very straightforward, that almost anyone will be able to know what the message of that painting or sculpture is. All working artists had to become members of the Reich Culture Chamber. So artists were not free to just go off and do whatever they wanted. They had to become appendages of the state or of the government. So essentially they were working for the state. And the Reich Culture Chamber licensed all artists to produce art or to become an artist. You actually had to have a license issued by the government. And if you fell out of favor with the government, you could be barred from making a living as an artist. You might not be allowed to teach art. That would be a very simple way to do that. You wouldn't be allowed to sell your paintings. And so that was a good way to put leverage on artists to paint and sculpt, draw, whatever, what the government wanted them to create. Let's now look at a few examples of paintings under the regime. So here we have an oil painting of Hitler from 1937. And again, this idea of him being wise, stern, perhaps in some ways haughty, or almost removed from the German people in a way. And this kind of ties into the Führerprinzip, the idea that Hitler knows all things, or Hitler embodies the will of the people. A very straightforward painting. This is another rather straightforward painting as well. You can see the soldiers, the vast majority of them looking at Hitler, some of them in awe, many of them smiling. They're almost hanging on his every word. And you can also see that the light is shining on Hitler there. There's a bit of shade in the background with some of the other German soldiers, but where Hitler is, that's where the light is. And so this is a really straightforward painting as well. And by the way, if you look at the quality of the painting, it's okay, I guess you could say, for somebody at the university level, perhaps, if they were making a painting like this. But it's just not great if you look at other famous paintings. There's something about it that's almost cartoonish in a way. We want to see our Führer. This is another painting that is pretty straightforward. You've got members of the SS creating a kind of human chain to hold back the crowd that just wants to see their Führer. You see the Nazi flag in the background, little babies as well, and peasant women, etc. Very straightforward. And this is an interesting one as well, a little bit different. Watersport 1936. These are German men rowing. And what's interesting about this is that they are all perfect human specimens. They're all muscular, they're all strong, and they are strong members of the Volksgemeinschaft. So we'll move on and look at another form of art, which is architecture. Architecture is sometimes forgotten as an art form, but it is. If you ever look at a church, you can see that there is artistry in many churches, especially if they're Roman Catholic or perhaps Anglican or Church of England type churches. They're often quite beautiful on the outside and indeed on the inside. So this can also be considered an art form, architecture. And of course, it doesn't have to be just churches. It can be other buildings as well. Well, the Nazis used architecture as a form of propaganda as well. So public buildings were built in a neoclassical monumental style. Neoclassical would harken back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And by monumental, I mean that these are big buildings that are imposing. And when you see them, you almost have a kind of wow factor about them. This is what Hitler said about the importance of architecture when it came to propaganda. Our enemies and our followers must realize that these buildings strengthen our authority. So if you have a government building and it looks quite imposing and it was quite orderly, which is what the neoclassical style is, it gives that idea that the state is powerful and orderly as well. So public buildings were symmetrical and enormous. In contrast, German homes were built in a traditional style with pitched roofs and shutters. This is, in some ways, tied into propaganda as well. The idea of the blood and soil, robust peasant, and they live this kind of traditional style, and so their houses should be traditional as well. So looking at some forms of Nazi architecture, you can see this German pavilion at the International Exposition in France in 1937 in Paris, and that kind of gives you an idea about what the Nazis liked when it came to public buildings. It's very symmetrical. Well, it's completely symmetrical, right angle lines, and there is this neoclassical style. The Zeppelin Field, built by Albert Speer, again, you've got symmetry, you've got hard lines, and you've got a style that harkens back on a much grander scale, I should say, to ancient Greece especially. The House of German Art in Munich, again, you can see the columns or the pillars there. Again, that's something that is very ancient, I guess we could say. That's when we think about ancient Greece, they would have their various types of... When we think about ancient Greece, those are the type of images that come to mind, those pillars and that type of thing. Now, this is more of a traditional German house. This was a residential housing for members of the SS. And again, you can see here it's not modern, and in fact, it's more of a traditional house. And similarly here, a traditional home for traditional Germans who are members of the Volksgemeinschaft. So moving on, art, literature, and the theater. Well, forbidden books were burned. The Nazis were big on book burnings. Dozens of authors and playwrights, Germans and foreigners, were banned. Some of the more famous ones, or two of the more famous ones, Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. No surprises here. Both of them were Jewish. Famous German novelists, academics, and playwrights, for example, Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, fled the country. Remarque famously wrote an anti-war book after World War I called All Quiet on the Western Front, one of the more famous anti-war books ever written. Students usually or often have to read that in high school. Very good book. I recall reading it in, I don't know, I think I was about 14, still left a mark. I still remember parts of the book all these years later. Novelists and playwrights were expected to produce pro-Nazi stories. What kind of things were they supposed to write about? Glorifying war, blood and soil, and of course glorifying the Volksgemeinschaft. So here's a photograph of a good Nazi book burning festival. You can see the people there, Sieg Heiling doing the Nazi salute and all that type of thing. You've got a bunch of books being torched in the foreground. So moving on to music. Well, Hitler's famous composers were glorified. Wagner, Strauss, Bruckner, famous classical composers. This was very much just a question of Hitler's personal taste. So he liked Wagner, so that was stressed. There's not an objective way to decide on music because music is such an abstract kind of art form. However, Jewish composers were banned, like Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn, by the way, was not Jewish, and certainly he would have seen himself as a Christian. His family had converted to Christianity at some point, but his ancestry was Jewish, so he was banned. Jazz was banned because it was considered degenerate Negroid music, and that was the word that the Nazis used. So this is kind of Black American music, Negro music, that was banned as well because it was degenerate because of the race of many jazz musicians and jazz composers. Experimental orchestral music was banned as well because it wasn't traditional, or indeed probably because Hitler didn't like it. Folk operas and stirring martial music was encouraged. Martial, that means militaristic, strong music was encouraged and promoted. Well, let's move on. How effective was propaganda under the NSDAP? We've looked at all these different forms of propaganda. How effective were they? Well, the propaganda was everywhere. It was omnipresent. It was ubiquitous, and it was relentless. It's in every nook and cranny in Nazi Germany. You can't really escape from it. So how effective was it? Despite it being everywhere, despite it being relentless, there are problems with the effectiveness of NSDAP propaganda. However, did propaganda convince those Germans who were not yet supporters to support National Socialism? Did propaganda win hearts and minds? Did it build and strengthen the Volksgemeinschaft? Did propaganda, number 3, increase the fervor and National Socialism of those Germans who already supported the NSDAP? And finally, did propaganda coordinate all cultural activities and media into National Socialism? And of course, these are the goals that we looked at the beginning of this lesson. Well, bottom line, it's very difficult to determine points 1 to 3. Well, why? Well, where is the evidence? We don't have a lot of evidence about the effectiveness of propaganda. It's nearly impossible to get into the souls or the hearts and minds of most Germans, or indeed in any historical investigation, because they don't leave behind a lot of evidence about what they think or what they feel. And any evidence that we have from the government can, one, be very incomplete, sometimes non-existent, and it can sometimes be misleading as well. So the bottom line is we just don't have much evidence to really be able to gauge the effectiveness of NSDAP propaganda. And also, people's attitude to the Nazi regime depended on multiple factors. Time, when are we talking about? Is it 1933? Is it 1935, 37, 41, whatever? It depends on place. What parts of Germany are they in? Is it different for people in Bavaria versus people in Prussia? It depends on what their occupation is, what their sex is, all those type of things, how old they are. So there's a lot of different factors at play when we try to decide, well, how effective was this propaganda? And another problem with propaganda is, how does a historian determine the importance of propaganda against other factors? So we might say, well, the NSDAP had a great deal of support by 1939. Well, how do we decide, well, propaganda is more important than Hitler's successes in foreign policy, or Hitler's delivering on his promises by solving unemployment, for example? It's very, very difficult for the historian to unpick the importance of propaganda against other things. And big surprise, the importance of propaganda is hotly debated by historians. Some historians argue that it's very, very important, or it was a very, very important factor. Others believe it was less important. Now, is there any type of consensus about the importance of propaganda? Well, there is among a lot of historians. And the consensus is this. Some consensus that propaganda reinforced existing attitudes, but probably did not create rabid converts to National Socialism. So what that means is, if you were already a believer in the NSDAP in 1933, the propaganda would reinforce your support for the regime as we move into 34, 35, 36, and so on. However, if you were not a believer in the regime in 1933, and especially if you were an opponent of the regime in 1933, there's no amount of propaganda that would likely change your mind to become a hardcore Nazi. So it's very much about what your existing beliefs were when it comes to propaganda. If you were somebody, let's say you were somebody slightly interested in Hitler and the NSDAP, let's say in 1933-34, maybe propaganda would push you towards support for the regime. And by the way, just as an aside, when I talk about propaganda in this way, we're really talking about adults. I think it's a different story for children. When we talked about indoctrination in a previous lesson, I think propaganda with children would be highly effective for the reasons we talked about before, because children often believe what they are told by adults. And so if you get children early and you propagandize to them and you twist reality, unfortunately, they will believe it. So here's a good quote from Richard Geary, a historian who wrote the book Hitler and Nazism. In general, Nazi propaganda was most successful where it could play upon traditional prejudices and values of German middle-class society, upon issues such as nationalism, anti-socialism, family values. but where the regime imposed traditional loyalties, it was far less successful, most obviously in the case of churches, as also amongst the German working class. So that's another good point. The idea that the propaganda already reinforces things that a lot of Germans already believe in, well, that's going to have an effect. It's going to strengthen those beliefs. However, if it's propaganda that is alien to the German people and it goes against their traditional views, you're not going to get a lot of traction from that propaganda. So when the Nazis would promote propaganda that was negative of the Catholic or Protestant churches, a lot of Germans would simply turn themselves off from that propaganda. Conclusions. Propaganda certainly helped the National Socialists maintain their rule. So it certainly did reinforce support for the regime in those people who already believed in it, and perhaps some of those people who were kind of on the fence, were a little bit interested in National Socialism. Propaganda would have or could have had an effect where they became more supportive of the regime. That's quite possible. If you were someone who is anti-Nazi, I don't think there's any amount of propaganda that's going to convince you to become a hardcore Nazi. It just doesn't work that way. Its significance is difficult to discern, dependent on the individual Germans. That's, of course, one of the big problems with propaganda as a historian. It's impossible to determine the importance of propaganda on people. Sometimes we get individuals who do leave diaries behind, and we might get an individual look into somebody's thinking. However, those are far and few between, and you can't really spin out from a couple of diaries what millions and millions of people were thinking. Germans who had become Nazis probably had their beliefs reinforced and strengthened, as I said a few minutes ago. Germans who supported the regime but were not Nazis may not have been particularly influenced. Women in the workforce, for example, and Christians. So we'll remember that both of those groups were propagandized to. Women were propagandized to leave the workforce. We know that that did not happen. In fact, women increasingly joined the workforce as the 1930s went on. And we know that the Christians were propagandized to adopt a kind of Nazi Christianity. And we saw that a lot of German Christians balked at that. They created the confessional church. The Catholic Church resisted that Nazification as well. So even though a lot of those people were supportive of the regime in other areas, they were not influenced by the propaganda when it came to women leaving the workforce and Christians abandoning traditional Christianity. And finally, children probably would have been influenced strongly since they were being indoctrinated at school and youth groups. So propaganda to them, if they were seeing posters and sculptures and paintings and the radio and newspapers and all that type of stuff, well, they're being indoctrinated in school, they're being indoctrinated in the Hitler Youth, they're being indoctrinated in the League of German Girls. So when they saw this other form of propaganda or other forms of propaganda, that would have a powerful effect on them as well, because they're being bombarded with propaganda everywhere, but they're also being indoctrinated. And again, children are a special case. So to sum up, I think propaganda helps explain why the National Socialists remained in power from 1933 to 1945 without really any significant rebellions and that type of thing. However, I would argue it's not the most important factor. We'll be talking about other factors in future lessons.